All right. So my name is Félix Mailleux. I'm advisor at the European Trade Union Confederation on climate and energy dossiers. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about adaptation because it is sometimes a topic that isn't so much discussed within the trade union movement. So I'm very glad to be here to talk to you about this. I'm sure Professor Van Ypersel provided you with a very clear view of the situation yesterday. Nevertheless, I would like to start my presentation by stating the obvious, and the obvious is that climate change is here and now. And I like to start my presentation with this picture here that you can see. And this picture represents the variation in temperature over the time. And you can see that it starts at the end of the year 800. And you can see that slowly the variation in temperature are getting warmer and warmer. And I think it's really important to keep in mind this kind of images when we are talking about climate policies in order not to forget what we are talking about. In more concrete terms, of course, everybody heard about the deadly floodings in Germany and Belgium. And recent studies clearly found that these were directly linked with climate change. A bit earlier than that, Spain also battled with wildfires and the biggest wildfire in 20 years. I think it was last year or 2 years ago. And not far from us, here in Belgium, we know that in 2019, heat waves have killed at least 716 people. So I think it's the right way to start tackling this topic is to look at where what the problem implies. Of course, for the trade unions, it's clear that these changes impact workers more and more. For example, the health and safety risk of the rise in temperature, it puts the life of many workers at risk because heat waves and increased temperature can provoke heat stress, heat stroke, that can lead to increased fatigue or increased risk of accidents. And all this is impacting workers' life. Similarly, extreme weather events such as wildfire or floods or storm are increasing the health and safety risk of workers who work outside and are also bringing tougher working conditions for these workers. The air pollution, UV radiation and new diseases are also among the effects of climate change that will impact the work. To illustrate this, I take an article from the Washington Post about an Olympic construction worker that died because of a heat waves in Japan. And I think that if we don't provide the sufficient adaptation policies in the future, this kind of event will arrive more and more. At the same time, these rise in temperature are bringing losses in productivity. A recent report from the International Labour Organization estimates that by 2030, around 2.2% of the total working hours worldwide will be lost because of higher temperature. And this represents around 80 million full-time jobs in the world. As I said, all the sectors are impacted. I will not go detailed sector by sector because I don't have time here. But over the next few slides, I've listed the effect in all the different sectors and which jobs will be impacted. So I will circulate the presentation after, and you will be able to have a look by yourself if you are interested. I insist on several sectors, agriculture and forestry, which will be particularly affected by less productivity and higher risk, health and safety risk for the workers. The construction sector as well will be particularly affected. Tourism to some extent, healthcare, and of course, emergency services. So all this to say that we absolutely need a worker-friendly adaptation strategy. And this is what I wanted to insist on in my intervention today. I wanted to present to you ETUC demands for such a workers-friendly adaptation strategy. And I think every time we talk about workers' working condition or workers' life, An important aspect is the governance in order to create the right policy measures. So what we are asking in the new adaptation strategy is to promote and monitor the involvement of trade unions and workers' representatives in the design and implementation of the adaptation policies. It's particularly important because adaptation measures really depend on the field situation, and measure can vary depending on the way you work, on the place you work, etc. So involving the trade union and the workers' representative who know the best how it is on the ground is very crucial to get right policies. Similarly, we ask to guarantee a strong and stable social dialogue to discuss the adaptation needs, identify workers' concerns, and develop the right policies. And at company level, we think that a very good way to develop adaptation measures could be to use more works council and health and safety committees to find concrete solutions with the workers. We as trade unions also recognize that we have our own role to play in this, and we can help raise awareness among the workers on the effects of climate change on their work. And we can also ensure the proper implementation of adaptation measures, for example, at company level, by flagging when these safety measures are not respected or relaying our concerns. In terms of policy measures, we as ETUC recommend to develop more research and studies to better assess the impact of climate change on the world of work. This has so far not been so much studied, and we really think that it's a huge challenge to identify all these effects, and there is a need for more studies. At the same time, we would like to see the adoption of new legislative initiatives to protect the workers from the negative effects. For example, a policy framework or a legislative proposal to protect workers from exposure to high temperature, because that doesn't exist at the EU level at the moment. We are also asking to ensure proper financing and staffing of public services. And I think here it will be crucial, especially for, we've seen it with the recent flooding, for firefighters, civil protection, and perhaps also some part of the militaries. And the nurses as well, or the hospital need to get more investment to cope with the future challenges. Of course, solidarity mechanism between EU member states and regions will be key, because some countries are less able to cope with the challenges ahead, while at the same time it's these countries that will suffer the most. And here I insist also on the dimension between the global south and the global north, where or between east and west, where usually it's the poorest or developing countries which will be the most impacted. And finally, in terms of policy demands, we also ask to reinforce social protection systems to protect the most vulnerable regions and people against the consequences of climate change. In terms of financing, it's important to keep in mind that the cost of inaction, if we don't take any adaptation measure, will be far greater than the cost of paying for adaptation measures. So this is kind of a no-brainer. We have to invest in adaptation policies, otherwise we will pay the price later. And for that, it's crucial to rely on sufficient financing to cover all these investment needs. And for us, since climate change will affect much more proportionally vulnerable households or low-income households, it's very important to closely link the discussion on financing and investment with discussion on fair taxation and on EU budget. And finally, as I was saying before, the international dimension in adaptation policy is really key, and because we need to develop adaptation solution with third-party countries, and we need to help also to finance that. I will perhaps finish my presentation by talking to you a little bit about the new adaptation strategy that was published in February. I understand that the next speaker will provide you with more detail on that. Just to provide you with our ETUC assessment, we think that there are some interesting elements in the new adaptation strategy. First of all, the introduction of this new concept of just resilience, which is interesting per se. However, it's a bit regrettable that this concept of just resilience is not clearly defined, and it has become perhaps kind of a catch-all concept. We also find interesting that the Commission recognized this time the impact of climate change on working conditions. So it's already a step forward. The mention of reskilling of workers and of the enforcement of employment on social legislation is positive. And in the strategy, the Commission also mentioned that it will consider proposing new initiatives to increase workers' protection, which is good to read, that is. However, we think from our own analysis and based on the recommendation that we had made before, we think that there is still room for improvement in that strategy. First of all, because it remains quite light on legislative pledges and it remains non-binding for member states. So it's more recommendation than a binding really legislative proposal. And here on the legislative pledges, we kind of regret that there is no policy framework for protection of workers against exposure to high temperature, for example, which could have been implemented. We also regret that the strategy focuses mainly on closing knowledge gap and improving data collection without so much concrete element, at least in terms of social dimension, to improve the social dimension of adaptation. In terms of governance, I think that there are some interesting ideas, but the strategy remains quite weak on the specific role that should be dedicated to social dialogue and trade union representative. And here we really call the Commission to explore more this solution, because we think it could really be a good way to make the adaptation measure percolate through the world of work and in the companies and sectors. And finally, we also regret the lack of clear guidance and objective for member states to invest in public services, such as emergency sectors or health system, and infrastructure and social protection. We think that these elements will be absolutely key to increase the resilience of our societies. The COVID-19 crisis has illustrated that, that strong social protection increased the resilience of society. And we think that the same is true also for adaptation to climate change, and this will be crucial. I thank you a lot for your attention, and I, of course, remain available to answer your question after.
So thank you so